In this Trust Talk episode, we discuss the relationship between psychology and the law, focusing on trust and procedural fairness. Our guest is Tom Tyler, a law and psychology professor at Yale and the founding director of the Justice Collaboratory. Tom highlights the importance of trust in legal institutions and explains how it fosters compliance more effectively than sanctions. He also explores how trust contributes to vibrant communities and shares strategies for law enforcement agencies to build positive relationships based on trust and fairness. Tom discusses the transformative movement in the American criminal legal system, emphasizing the shift towards trust building rather than punishment. He mentions the Ombudsman institution in the Netherlands as an example of procedural justice principles applied in administrative and civil law. Your host is Severin DeWitt.
Tom, great to have you here on Trust Talk. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show. I learned that you wear two hats. You are a law professor and a psychology professor. I think that's quite an intriguing and unique combination.
Well, let me say first off, thank you for inviting me to talk to you. I am by training a psychologist, and I'm not a lawyer. So it's especially interesting that I would end up teaching in a law school. I think it shows what I would call a paradox in law, at least in the legal academy. And that is, first, so much of the law is really dependent upon beliefs about psychology. That's true in all through the areas like evidence and jurisprudence. Just to give one specific example, the law says to people all the time, when you make this decision, put aside your biases. But it is well known to psychologists that implicit biases are not something that people actually are aware of, and so therefore not something that they can put aside. The law, however, has been built largely based upon philosophy, jurisprudence, and human assumptions about human nature. So even though psychology is built into the law, it's seldom based upon actual psychological research. So the irony is that I am a psychologist, I am in a law school, but behavioral scientists in law schools are very rare. And so much of the law is based upon psychology, but not really based upon what psychologists know about psychology. I'm the only psychologist at Yale Law School. Stanford Law School has a psychologist. Most other law schools in America don't have behavioral scientists like psychologists. So we still live very much in an era where people's assumptions about psychology guide the law, not actual psychological research. Therefore, it's a really interesting position to be in and a great opportunity for me to be able to speak directly to the law school community, which is why even though I'm not a lawyer, I'm very happy to be in a law school.
Well, let's talk about it a little further. Considering your background in psychology and law, for me it's evident that you possess a unique insight and expertise in both legal and psychological aspects of trust, the subject of today. How do these interdisciplinary approaches contribute to our understanding of trust within the context of law? And what distinct insights do they offer that may not be apparent from a single discipline perspective?
Well, this follows very nicely from the question you asked me before. Obviously, so much of the law is based upon trust in legal institutions. I know a word that's used a lot in the literature is legitimacy, but trust is really a central component of legitimacy. You can't really pick up a paper any day now without reading some story about, do the American people trust the Supreme Court? Do they trust Congress? Do they trust the law? So trust is central to discussions in law schools in the field of law, central to the ability of the legal system to actually work. On the other hand, as we were saying, in law schools, ideas about trust really are not based upon empirical research about trust. They're based upon philosophy, on jurisprudence. And so, as a behavioral scientist, what I think I can bring to the discussion, now being dominated by one discipline, which is law, is a perspective that they don't usually take into account when they talk about things like trust. Max Weber, the famous sociologist, said that there's really two different issues about trust in legal authorities. One is a normative question of why people should obey authorities, which I'd say is the perspective that dominates law. And then there's the separate question of why people will obey authorities, which is really an empirical research based question that involves study of what people do. And that's where the perspective of behavioral science brings something unique to the discussion of trust.
Can you share any examples of case studies where the principles and theories discussed in what you just said and in your books have been successfully applied to real-world scenarios, leading to positive outcomes in terms of cooperation, trust, or legal compliance?
There has been an important movement within the American criminal legal system to change the way the courts and the police function based upon social science research about trust. Traditionally, the model that governed the way that courts and the police think about how they get compliance is sanctions. If you want people to do what you tell them to do, you threaten them. You say, if you don't obey the law, you'll be caught and punished. That has been found for a very long time to be a pretty mediocre system of social order. You can get people's behavior to change in that way, but it's hard to implement. Particularly, it's hard because it's hard to surveil mass populations in a way that makes it very credible to people that you will catch and punish them. So, a really important contribution of behavioral science research has been to show that actually, whether people trust the law and trust legal authorities has more influence on their compliance than any estimate they might make of the risk of being caught and punished. So, there's been an enormous transformation, both in the way judges think about the legal system, in the way the police think about how they should relate to the public, towards trying to create and build trust. I think we can use an example going on right now in France, where we've just seen an entire week of social protest about the behavior of the police. What has been the response of the French government? To threaten the population. We will arrest you, we will punish you, you must obey the law. And I think it illustrates very well how that doesn't work in an environment where people are mistrustful of the law, mistrustful of the police. So France is an interesting contrast to the United States, and I would say, with great respect, to many countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, Germany, where they've taken very seriously the idea that if you want a good relationship with the public that will lead to compliance, you have to create the conditions where the public trusts you.
As a co-author of Legitimacy and the Maintenance of Public Order, I think that was from 2012, you discussed the three ideas underlying the rule of law: acting in accordance with the law, respecting legal rights, and respecting people's dignity. How do these ideas contribute to building trust in legal systems?
Well, the first idea builds on what you asked me in the previous question. Understanding that having the trust of the public really matters. For many decades in America, legal authorities didn't really pay much attention to how the public felt about the law because they thought that a sanction-based model would work, and so therefore they could simply impose themselves on communities without having to talk to those communities. We know now, because of behavioral science research, and this is the first crucial point, that having trust within the community is a better way to get compliance than threatening people. So that's the first idea, that you should actually care about whether the public trusts you. The second important contribution of social science has been to say, and we can actually tell you a lot about how to get and keep that trust. We know why people trust authorities. And the key concept there is the concept of procedural fairness, that what people want when they deal with the police, when they deal with the courts, is they want the public to be treated with dignity and respect, to be listened to have policies and practices explained to them, all concepts of what the public sees as a fair process or procedure for exercising authority. And social science research has shown that all of these things, voice, neutrality, respect, are more important in whether people trust authorities than any outcome that the authorities might provide, like a good or bad outcome. And then the final idea, and I think maybe the one that's most distinct from the way many people think about things, is the idea that people understand fairness as being about more than just neutrality. If you ask most legal authorities, like a judge, they would say, okay, fairness is being rule-based, consistent, neutral. That is part of fairness. But people also consider things that we call relational. Do you treat me with dignity? Do you respect my concerns in the situation? Do you show sincerity? Do you show benevolence? Does it seem like you are taking account of the needs of the people you're dealing with in thinking about and making your decisions? So we call these relational because they're about messages of standing and status. If I ignore what you say, if I won't listen to you, if I won't explain myself, I'm disrespecting you, I'm demeaning you. And if you live in a society where you feel you are a citizen and entitled to equality of equal treatment, people find that very unfair. And they find it unfair even if the judge is being neutral and unbiased. They also think the judge should be neutral and unbiased. But I think most legal authorities already think that. What they haven't traditionally thought was important is I should also be polite, respectful, attentive, courteous. I should show that I'm listening and caring about the needs of the people that are appearing before me. So those are the three ideas that come out of social science research. Trust matters. Trust is linked to fair procedures, and fair procedures have both decision making and an interpersonal element.
So if I were to summarize what you just said, it's basically the personal experiences with procedural justice that significantly impact somebody's perception of legitimacy. Is that right?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that views about the legitimacy of government, trust in government authorities, come up out of personal experience. But I also think it's important for me to say that people also look around them and they care about what's going on in their community. So if I were to ask you, do you trust the police? You would consider both how the police have treated you and how you have seen them treat other people in your community. And people combine those two pieces of information. But it is absolutely correct that if you ask people, are the police, let's say in Germany, trustworthy? One important element is whether people have experience dealing with the police and what happened to them.
I remember from one of the conversations I had earlier for the Trust Talk podcast, I forgot with whom, that it happened in many cases that if a criminal is being judged by the court to a sentence, he or she is still, I would not use the word content of course, but he's still satisfied with the procedure because they were confronted with a judge that did what you just explained, namely was respectful, listened, cared about his or her view, and therefore the punishment was more acceptable than if it was just something like, oh, I hear your story, I'm not interested in the background, here's my verdict.
Yes, and one of the really important areas of work in this area that has particularly been spearheaded by Dutch researchers is the role of procedural justice in prisons. And it's absolutely correct that if prisoners feel that they got a fair trial and they feel that the prison authorities treat them fairly, that when they come out of prison, they're significantly less likely to break the law again. So there's clear long-term gain through treating people in ways that they experience as being fair.
In your book, Why People Obey the Law, you write about the relationship between trust and legal compliance. Can you give us insights on how trust shapes individuals' decisions to obey the law and its broader implications for the functioning of the whole legal system?
Sure. Think about two different ways that people could relate to law. One way they could relate to law that has been the focus of a lot of traditional authority is they could be afraid that they would be caught and punished if they broke the law, which we would call a risk orientation. Another way that they could look at their relationship to the law is that they trust the authorities who create and enact the law so that they feel that following the law is good for them, good for society. And so those people would be what we would call internally motivated. They would be following the law because they think it's the right thing to do, because they trust the benevolence and sincerity of the people who create and implement the law. And what we have found is that's a better system. It's a better system because it's easier for the state to implement because you don't have to be trying to surveil people all the time because they're being self-regulating. And it's also a better system because if people trust the authorities, they don't simply comply, they also cooperate. If you look at communities where distrust is high, what is it that the police complain about? No one will ever tell them where criminals are. No one will ever identify criminals. No one will testify. Cooperation, because people trust the authorities, benefits the police in terms of what they call clearance. In other words, being able to solve crimes and punish offenders. So you gain a much more cooperative relationship with the population if it's based upon trust. And I think that's really a crucial point from the perspective of why trust isn't just a different system, but actually a superior system.
Actually, I think you already covered what I had intended to ask you, namely whether you could elaborate a little bit on the three consequential outcomes and their implications for fostering trust, like legitimacy, cooperative behavior, and trust within communities. But I think you gave already an answer to that question, didn't you?
Well, let me say one more thing that comes out of this question. The law traditionally has had a very one-sided view of its goal, and that is the goal is to get people to comply with the law. Or even the way I talked about cooperation, to get people to cooperate with the police in enforcing the law. But what we've seen in the recent literature is much more discussion about the viability of communities. What can the law do to make the community in which the law is operating a more viable community, politically, socially, economically? And the traditional approach has been basically to say nothing. The law is designed to stop crime, and that's the way in which it works. But one of the benefits of a trust-based system of authority is if people trust the legal authorities in their community, they engage more in those communities. They engage socially, they are more connected to other people. Politically, they're more involved in governance. Economically, they're more likely to shop and otherwise patronize opportunities in their community. So that actually a trust-based system has the advantage of building the quality, the viability of the community within which it's working. Whereas a sanction-based system is basically, even if it's maintaining social order, it's a forever policing system because it doesn't build trust. And so you need the police now, you need the police next week, next year, et cetera, because you haven't really built any trust among the population. You've just lowered the crime rate. But if you have a trust-based system, you can imagine over time that the need for surveillance, the need for policing goes down as the community becomes stronger. I think that's a really important way that trust is a different way of thinking about authority than a risk-based surveillance system. You can imagine, and research suggests it's not imagination, it's true, that if you build trust, you are actually encouraging the community to make itself more viable.
Can you share with us any examples or case studies where the principles and the theories that we discussed and you deal with in your books have been successfully applied to real-world scenarios, leading to positive outcomes in terms of cooperation, trust, or legal compliance?
Sure. So we have seen in the United States, primarily in the area of policing, a number of efforts by different communities to implement procedural justice in policing through training of police officers, changes in policies and practices. And the research shows that if those changes are put into policing, then trust in policing and the impunity goes up. Crime is effectively controlled as much as has ever been true under any other strategy. So, positive outcomes, as much compliance as we get under a sanction-based strategy, but then the other outcomes that I've already talked about. In addition, you build trust, you build cooperation, you promote engagement of the population in the community. And one other thing that I would mention, because it seems relevant here, is when people talk about these strategies, they often think about this is something that you train the police, train judges for dealing with the people who come before them. You can call them their customers or the disputants or the people who are charged with a crime. But we have found that one of the biggest benefits comes if you improve the procedural justice within the court or the police system. Police officers, for example, often feel just as unfairly treated by their superiors as people in the community feel unfairly treated by the police. And so you can proceed by indirection. You can change the internal climate of the police department. You can train superiors to treat line officers more fairly. And as a consequence, the line officers experiencing more fairness in their own daily lives treat the people in the community more fairly. So you can change the way the community experiences the police in two ways: by telling police officers treat the people in the community more fairly, or by giving them an example in their own work environment of why procedural fairness is better, which they then carry with them out onto the street. Both of which have been shown in research to maintain social order, but also build trust and cooperation.
That's a nice bridge to my next question. Trust can be influenced by various societal and cultural factors. How does your work consider the influence of cultural diversity and social norms on trust in the law? And what implications does it have for promoting trust in a multicultural and diverse society?
One of the good things about procedural justice as a strategy is that we find that there's a broad consensus about what constitutes a fair procedure among different ethnic groups, across gender, across economic class. There's a general consensus about what's fair. The idea of voice, that you should be given a chance to say what's on your mind, state your case. The idea of neutrality, that things should be transparent and should be explained to you, and there should be a lack of bias, consistency, the idea that you're deserving of respect and courtesy, and trusting basically that the authorities you're dealing with are trying to do what's right for the people in the community, are universal features that the members of all the different ethnic cultural groups that I've studied think are important. Now, I don't want to therefore claim that procedural justice is a worldwide universal phenomenon. It's been primarily studied in the United States, Europe, Japan, in what we might call more advanced industrialized societies. But wherever it's been studied in those societies, it's been found to be generally the principle that everyone uses to react to legal authority. So let's say it's a widespread phenomenon. That's why I think it has been so important to authorities, because they can address the concerns of in the United States of all the major ethnic groups at the same time.
Tom, till now we have been discussing the role of trust very much in the criminal law. Do you see any similar trends or similar results from your study in civil law?
Well, absolutely, yes. In fact, it's true. We have been kind of focused on criminal law because that's what's been most salient, but there's a parallel body of research on administrative procedures, where people deal with administrative law judges are actually in the Netherlands, the ombudsperson. The ombudsperson in the Netherlands has trained his staff to use procedural justice principles in dealing with grievances that people bring against the government. And then civil court, quite a lot of research on the cases that people bring themselves for damages. Again, in those cases, it's more common for people to represent themselves, what we call pro se litigation. But the finding is that people react to their experience at small claims court and civil court pretty much in the same way that I've talked about. A very interesting study done of why people appeal civil court decisions. It's not because they win or lose, it's because they feel that the hearing was not fair. So yes, same principles, civil court, administrative law.
Tom, I finish my interviews mostly with the same sort of question, namely directed to the future. What challenges do you foresee for legal young researchers in the field of trust in the years to come? How do you believe these challenges will shape the landscape of trust research and impact the development of future legal scholars in this area?
As I've mentioned to you, in various areas, there's a lot of empirical research that the law could draw upon. I think the challenge for the future is to get people in legal environments to do that. So when you compare so much of what's going on in law, so much of legal education, it just doesn't pay attention to empirical research. So that is really the biggest challenge to me is we have a lot of information that would be very valuable to the legal system in terms of improving it. The trick is to get the system to see empiricism as a tool for improvement. Now, again, I want to say that I'm, of course, in the United States, but I have great respect for the Netherlands, which I feel like is much further along this route. They have not only got psychologists like Kees van den Bos in law schools, he's at Utrecht, but government is paying a lot of attention to the findings of psychologists in talking about social policy issues. I would long for a day when policymakers in the United States would be so attentive, so interested in empirical research. I think that for people in America, certainly that's the biggest challenge is to sell our product to the primary constituency, which is the legal system.
Well, we have come to the end of the interview. Tom, you made a very strong case that social science should be on all law faculties, no matter where on the globe. We are far from that still.
I understand. It's a beginning.
It's a beginning. You made a good point about that and also very sharply formulated why it is so important for law practitioners also to consider the role of trust in law. Thank you very much for being our guest today. It was very insightful. I wish you all the best and a lot of new books.
Well, thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to give my message to the community.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.